Payne and Pendergast, Sean Pendergast, Seth Payne, and good to talk right now to the general manager of the Houston Texans. It is a busy, busy time with free agency coming up next week and the draft. Whole lot to get to with Nick Caserio here on Sports Radio 610. Nick, really good to have you on the show. How are you?
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Seth. Great to be here. Excited to be here. Looking forward to kind of these next few weeks. It's a really good opportunity, really, for the entire team, the organization. So, we're going to try to do the best we can with our opportunities in front of us.
How have the first 60 days or so gone for you? How's it gone versus what your expectations were for the job?
Yeah, honestly, it's been awesome. When going back kind of almost 2 months, right, since I was hired, that, we kind of had that initial press conference that Friday. There's a lot of things that were still up in the air relative to the staff, kind of the coaching search, right? So once we worked through that and once we were able to get the full coaching staff in place, once David was hired, we were able to kind of get our feet on the ground a little bit and then really just kind of start the work, right? I mean, this is a process, right? We're kind of new staff on a lot of different levels, new coaching staff, front office, personnel. So that's all part of it. And the one thing that's pretty consistent each year is we all know that those of us that have been in the league and have seen it, there's change, right? Anytime there's something new, there's going to be change, right? And there's always multiple things that go along with that. There's never a one size fits all. So honestly, it's been awesome. A lot of really good people in the building. Excited to come to work each day and really just take it one day at a time, understanding that this is a long road in front of us, right? Nothing's going to change overnight, and it's going to take a series of good decisions along the way, and we're just going to try to make the best decisions we can on a consistent basis as much as possible.
Nick, look, I know things are constantly shifting in the NFL, and this year it seems like they shift very, very fast. And the situation here shifted seemingly as soon as you got here. Let me ask you this, which might sound like a very basic question, but I don't think I've necessarily heard anybody address it head on yet. Did Deshaun Watson request a trade?
Yeah, I would say, just to your question, Seth, anything on a personal basis, what a player says, what a player does, honestly, that's really more of a personal discussion. What's discussed, whether it's with the player or with the representative. I would say, just generally speaking, in the offseason, there's a lot of information flow, right? And we have these gaps, right? News cycles, right? So everybody is kind of looking for some information, looking for something, because really once the Super Bowl is over, right, you have this gap in time, right? Call it February to the start of free agency, where there's a lot of things that could happen, could not happen, a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of discussions about some things. So really what you try to do as best you can is focus on the things that you can control, which is what you're doing in the building, right? Going through the team, understanding the people in the building. And the reality is you're having discussions with a lot of different people, right? A lot of different representatives, a lot of different players. We've probably talked to literally every team in the league just relative to their roster situation. I mean, you guys are seeing it really in real time, the number of players that are being released, right, from existing teams, and some players who were just signed to contracts last year in free agency, really at this time, right? So again, you can't really worry about so many things externally that are going on. You just have to be aware of them, and just really whatever conversations you have out of respect to the individual that you're having them with, they should stay there. And that's what we've tried to do as best we can.
What's the best case scenario in your mind right now, Nick, as it pertains to Deshaun Watson?
Yeah, I think the reality is we're just going to focus on really where we are today. I mean, the thing that's in front of us right now is the free agency prep, right? I'd say we've taken, honestly, the last 2 weeks, we've had a lot of extensive meetings with the staff relative to what are some of the things that we're going to be able to do here. We have an understanding financially, every team does, of what the salary cap is going to look like. We actually have prepared ourselves. We're actually in a pretty good position, a better position now than we were maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? So we're probably going to be able to go in free agency a little bit and identify some players that are going to help us in some capacity. So really that's the immediate focus. As far as anything beyond that, to talk about the hypotheticals and what that looks like is probably not really fair to anybody. So again, I've made my comments. I made my comments beginning in the press conference of how I feel about Deshaun. Really hasn't changed from this perspective. So what we're going to try to do next week is starting really Monday, because that's really the first opportunity that you can actually start to exchange proposals with representatives about players that you might add to your team. Really, that's the thing that we're on the precipice of doing, and what really we're going to try to allocate our time and resources.
As we see veteran players either being released or renegotiating their contracts with this reduced cap this year, is this Is your strategy towards free agency something where you know that it's going to have to change based on potentially a huge number of veteran guys out there and it potentially being a buyer's market compared to most years?
Yeah, I mean, not to boil it down to basic economics, right? But it's supply and demand, right? So certain positions may have more supply, and then what's the demand? So then how does that match up with the contract? Say, generally speaking, Seth, to your question, the people at the top of the market, more than likely, they're going to get the contracts that are probably commensurate with that level. And then you're going to have another pool of players, right, that you're going to have to sift through that are either coming off of a contract situation, coming off of an injury situation, coming off a situation maybe where they didn't play football last year, right? Like in the case of Justin Britt, just to speak to our situation, right? So there's going to be different situations and different scenarios. So you're really just going to have to try to make sound decisions. I would say not to oversimplify it, but if we can just, meat and potatoes, hit some singles and doubles, try to improve the depth of our team, try to create as much competition as possible, really that's probably the most rational strategy. It doesn't mean like if we see a player that we think is to a point that he really can help us and is going to have an impact, we'll always look at that. But just understand that if you do that, it's going to come at the expense of maybe 3 or 4 other players, right? So what's the risk reward? What's the trade-off relative to the value that you might be getting from that player? So I would say those are the things in our minds, in my mind, kind of how we're approaching it and how we're viewing it.
Nick Caserio, Texans general manager, joining us on Sports Radio 610. So Nick, you came from a place that had the same quarterback for 20 years, was never below 500. The situation here is obviously different with the draft capital and with the record last year. Your approach, what have you taken from the 20 years you spent in New England that maps to the approach here? And does the word rebuild even enter the vernacular of a general manager?
Not necessarily, Sean. Really, the reality is each team, all of us are sort of restarting our team for the 2021 season, right? So really that's the approach. You're sort of restarting from ground zero, right? Really, with the new league year, puts everybody kind of in the same position, right? So as it pertains to what have I learned the most or what would I take the most is just try to make good decisions, understanding that every decision is probably not going to work out maybe the way that you hoped or whatever the extenuating circumstances are, but just try to make good decisions, try to be consistent, try to be very, very thorough with your thought process and have a plan for that player and try to create as much competition as possible, right? I think those are things philosophically that are consistent year to year. And relative to our situation, we can't change anything that's happened in the past relative to a contract, whether to draft picks that may or may not have been accumulated or lost. We can't necessarily worry about that. We can just kind of look at our situation and maximize the opportunities with the resources we have in front of us. And that's what we have a responsibility to do. That's my responsibility to the coaching staff and to the rest of the organization.
Nick, I currently have 6,220 unread emails in my inbox. I'm looking at it right now. You seem like a different kind of guy that doesn't have any unread emails in your inbox. If somebody calls with a trade proposal and it goes to voicemail, what do you do with that? What do you do with that voicemail? Do you have a spreadsheet with the trade proposal written down somewhere?
Seth, information is information, however you get it, right? So what you choose to do with that information, that's your choice, right? So I would say, just to your question, we're kind of laughing about it, but the reality is there's a lot of information that flows back and forth from between teams, right? And it's really amongst clubs just talking about, a number of different types of things, right? So wherever the information exists, whatever platform that's on, it's good information. What you choose to do with it is ultimately your choice. So that's how I would say I handle those.
Nick Caserio joining us on Sports Radio 610. What are your expectations for David Johnson?
Yeah, I think our expectations are the same for every player, right? It's a new opportunity. It's a new team. And really what we're going to ask those players to do is just be the best version of yourself and just try to perform to the best of your ability, whatever that role is. We're not going to define what your role is. We can sit here. I can tell you, Sean, well, this is what I think his role is going to be. Okay, that might look good on paper, but ultimately the players are going to dictate what their role is. And what you want to try to stay away from is pigeonholing a player into one spot, right? So again, you might find as you're working through it, hey, you know what, this player might be better suited over here. Let's try to focus on that. I think our philosophy relative to team building is focus on what a player can do, right? And then put that player in a position that accentuates those strengths and try not to ask a player to do something maybe that he doesn't do as well. And maybe you can complement that with someone or something that somebody else possesses, right? So a lot of respect for David. Spent a lot of time with him coming out. He's actually a player that we visited in New England as part of our 30-man visits. I would say personally, there's not a lot of change, just the relative to the person that he is. And he's had production at different points. So again, like, this is a new year. It's a new opportunity for him. And we're excited to have him on the team and excited to have him here moving forward.
Because of the cap situation this year, I know that in a normal year, general managers have to be very careful about approaching guys and asking them to take pay cuts or to even restructure, depending on what the restructure looks like. Is it potentially a little bit easier or more understandable in a year like this that you might have to ask some guys to take some pay cuts and perhaps they understand it or get it more because of the reduced cap?
Yeah, it's a great question, Seth. The reality is just try to be honest as possible, right? And, you're not trying to hide anything. And I think some people understand it more than others. Some, probably don't give people enough credit on the other side. They might be looking at it the same way you're looking at it and saying, you know what, all right, you know what, maybe this doesn't really quite make sense. All right. And if there's a mutual interest, right, then you could probably reach a resolution. By the same token, if it's something that you don't feel is going to work for both sides, no problem. Like, we understand that you might have to move on from a player, right? So I think, again, most are pretty open-minded. And I would say from our perspective, we just try to communicate and be honest with them. Like, here's what we'd like to be able to do. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, we understand that too. There's no hard feelings, because I think one of the things that you're going to find is whoever that player is represented by, right, you're probably going to have another interaction along a line somewhere else because they're going to have another player. So if you're just honest and transparent and try to handle it as professionally as possible, they probably respect that, even if they don't agree with it. And that's okay. I mean, that's just part of the business that we're in.
Nick, was it difficult from a general manager's perspective? Was it difficult to let JJ Watt walk in a release as opposed to seeing if there was a market where you could get something back for him?
Yeah, I would just say this, and I had a couple of great conversations with JJ. I have a lot of respect for him as a player. He's been a great player in this league a long time. He's done a lot for the organization. He's done a lot for the city of Houston. We certainly wish him well with the opportunity he has in front of him. We're moving forward. He's moving forward. So there's no hard feelings on either side of it, and have a lot of respect for how he's handled himself and what he's done. And, unfortunately, these decisions, sometimes they don't always follow one particular path. And ultimately, whatever the decision is, you make the decision and you just move forward. So that's how we've approached it and how we're approaching it.
In David Culley's press conference, he said that he wasn't aware of any. I don't want to paraphrase inaccurately. He said he wasn't aware of Deshaun Watson being unhappy with the team. Is that because perhaps he's staying completely on the coaching side and you're staying on the business side, or where exactly is he coming from when he says he's unaware of any discontent whatsoever?
Well, I don't want to speak for David, right? But, David wasn't here, hasn't been here for what has happened in the past. That's all we can control are the things that are in front of us, right? So David and I talk about the team on a day-to-day basis. He has conversations with different players, with different people. I'm certainly respectful of those conversations, and those are private conversations. So I don't want to speak for David on anything that he said, Seth. I think in the end, we're working in a collective fashion as best we can and try to put together as best a team as possible, whatever that looks like, understanding that there's going to always be a lot of moving parts on a year-to-year basis.
Nick Caserio, Texans general manager, joining us on Sports Radio 610. Nick, what's it been like trying to gather intel on this draft class with all the restrictions going on with COVID? How different is this for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It in some respects, it's not too dissimilar to last year, right? The difference is you had the combine kind of before we had the break, right? So you had the Senior Bowl. That was a good opportunity for our staff to get information on 100 or so, however many players were there, right? So that was a useful exercise. James Lipford and the college staff, Matt Bazergan, that group, we had people that were in Mobile. And again, at this point, you're just trying to accumulate as much information as possible, but by the same token, you're trying to accumulate the right information, right? I mean, that's the most important thing. So I would say we're in the process of working through those individual calls, the FaceTime calls. Like, there's certain rules and restrictions that are in place relative to what teams can and can't do. But you just sort of have to shift your gear a little bit about how you access that information. So we'll use the resources and tools that we have. we won't treat it any differently than we have in the years past. It's just a different means of gathering the information.
It's Nick Caserio, Texans general manager, joining us here on Sports Radio 610. Nick, know it's a super busy time for you. Free agency coming up next week. You got a draft coming up after that. Certainly appreciate the insight, and we look forward to doing it again with you soon. Thank you very much for the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time. Happy to be here. Have a great weekend.